Oke, ya. Share screen-nya nanti dari saya atau dari Ibu?
Nanti saya sendiri, tapi saya kirim sekarang sebagai backup.
Wih, kami sudah punya.
Enggak, agak berbeda.
Oh, oke.
Ini sudah di-update.
Terima kasih.
Tapi hanya backup-nya ya?
Ya.
Oke.
Hello. Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar, Alternative Solutions in Facing COVID-19 across Southeast Asia. This webinar, co-organized by Altersi, Fiskom Universitas Kristen Satyawacana, C Junction, and Sankt Azidusudes. Today's webinar will comprise a panel discussion and question and answer. For the best experience, please mute your microphone. Please feel free to type your question in the question and answer function that you may find at the bottom of your Zoom window. And allow me to introduce you to our moderator, C. Natalia Sukmi. Natalia, please.
Thank you, Truly. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope we are in a good condition today. First of all, I would like to send my gratitude to Altersi for inviting me as a moderator in this great international webinar entitled Alternative Solution in Facing COVID-19 across Southeast Asia. My name is Natalia. I'm a member of Altersi, and I'm a lecturer at Fakultas Ilmu Sosial dan Ilmu Komunikasi in Universitas Kristen Satyawacana, Indonesia. We have 3 departments here: Sociology, Communication Science, and International Relations. Personally, I focus on Communication Science, but now I live in Paris to pursue my PhD in Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle, Sorbonne Alliance. Today, we have panel sessions with 6 honorable speakers for discuss and get an insight into the alternative solution of COVID-19 pandemic in health, economic, political, and social consequences. We will emphasize our discussion in Southeast Asia cases, mainly how the regional government respond to the pandemic, especially for vulnerable populations. Before we continue to enter our main agenda, I would like to invite Gabriel Fakal as a founder and simultaneously the convener of this program to explain more about Altersi. Gabriel, time is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Oui.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I am Gabriel Fakal, co-founder of Altersi, together with Gloria Trulli Estrelita, and we run the observatory with Sarah Andrieux. We are members from Centre Asie du Sud-Est, the Southeast Asian Center of Social Research in France, located in Paris. The webinar is our first public event, and therefore I would like to make a short presentation of our aim and actions. Our goal is to study alter politics based on 2 possible declinations of the term alter, which are alternatives and alterity. Alternatives consist of collective mobilizations that challenge the dominant political paradigms. They concern social movements as well as systems of social regulation. These systems are less visible, but they sustain local capacities for political action. Then, alterity refers to social movements embracing an open and inclusive vision of society that treats all its citizens with respect and provides them with equal access to civil and political rights. One of our main tasks will be the definition of alter politics. In order to study these issues, we collaborate with 4 institutions based in Southeast Asia, among which Southeast Asia Junction, which is headed by Rosalia Scortino here. Currently, Altersi comprises of around 50 members from a dozen of countries, under the supervision of a scientific board. Our members come from various backgrounds, such as academia, social activism, art, NGOs, foundations, think tanks, and public policy institutions. This year, our main event will be an international digital conference that is planned on July the 7th, 8th, and 9th. Regarding today's webinar, our aim is to address the most current trends of alter politics in a context of cumulative and systemic challenges intertwining ecological crisis, epidemic, and political failures. Our starting point is Houghton's analysis, according to which COVID-19 crisis is not the result of a pandemic, but of a syndemic. From this perspective, the virus interacts with a number of non-communicable diseases. This interaction takes place in a social and environmental context characterized by deep social inequity, since infection is much higher in impoverished communities who cannot meet hygiene standards and social distancing. The recent passing of our esteemed colleague and dear friend, Dr. Abdul Hamid, is yet another dramatic and deeply saddening example of this phenomenon. Dr. Hamid was the victim of a corrupted and nepotistic system that plagued the academic and health system in his region in Indonesia. Previously diagnosed with diabetes and having limited access to resources, like most of his colleagues, the virus gave him no chance. Seeing COVID-19 not as a pandemic, but as a syndrome, is not a simple change in terminology. Understanding the health crisis we are going through from a broader conceptual framework paves the way for better identifying the systems at work behind the biosocial political problems that we face. It allows, for example, to better take into account the combined impact of liberal policies, reactionary ideas, and authoritarian population management systems. This perspective sheds light on how public policies are based on social engineering techniques from what is called nudging economics. They are subconsciously inducing individuals to behave in a certain way. Finally, this perspective enables us to consider more appropriate solutions than simple repression and blaming the victim for the spread of the disease. Thus, we will now discuss a number of bottom-up and more or less coordinated initiatives that offer alternatives to the confinement of thought and so-called social distancing. Thank you so much. I give the word to Ibu Rosalia Scortino.
Thank you, Gabriel. Maybe I will send my deep condolences also for our colleagues, Dr. Abdul Hamid. So if you're interested with Altersea, please check on the website or contact them directly by email. Now we arrive at our panel sessions. I will read the short curriculum vitae of each of our honorable speakers before they speak. Then I will give each speaker to deliver their presentation up for about 15 minutes. I also invite all participants to respect our rules and share your comments and questions in the chat box. So Truly and I will read and then we will deliver to the speaker. For the first honorable speakers, let me read the curriculum vitae of Rosalia Sciortino. She will present COVID-19 as a systematic crisis, the value of social science to analyze alternative solutions. Dr. Lia is a cultural anthropologist and development sociologist who defined herself as a global citizen landed in Southeast Asia from Europe. She is associate professor at Institute for Population and Social Research, Mahidol University, Thailand, visitor professor in the Master in International Development Studies, Chulalongkorn University, Thailand, and also founder and executive director of Sea Junction, a public avenue for interaction and cross-learning on Southeast Asia. If you want to understand more about Sea Junction, please find the information on www.seajunction.org. Now, let me invite our first honorable speaker, Dr. Lia. Time is yours. Sorry, mute. Yes, I think you need to.
Yes, I need to mute, but can you allow me to share the PowerPoint? Okay. Yeah. So I think already Gabriel has given in few words my presentation, because I will make basically the same points that To understand COVID-19, the impacts, and try to address those, we need to look at the pandemic not so much only as a pandemic, but as a failure of a system, environmental system, social system, economic system, what many call as a cascade of synchronous failure that are happening at the same time. As also Gabriel has mentioned in a recent opinion piece in The Lancet by the editor of The Lancet, which is a medical journal, nota bene, Orton mentioned that we are confronted with a syndemic, a term used by sociologists in the past to stress that the vulnerability of people to the pandemic is because of social factor, and because of this social factor, the health also make them more vulnerable again, also to economic and others. So it is an interaction, and if we don't break this circle of this interaction between health vulnerability and social vulnerability, we will not be able to address the pandemic and its impacts. Now, I want to show that how social science is connected to this approach. For us, actually, what Orton is saying, social scientists, nothing new. It's something that social scientists, medical anthropologists, medical sociologists have been saying for years about that. But the question is whether we have been able to apply that knowledge and to have it recognized, and most important, whether policy are acting based on that particular knowledge. So I want to go quickly through 7 areas where I think we really need to do more to ensure that social science is taken into account. Now, the first, of course, has to do with the very origin of COVID-19. I think we know very well now that actually it's nothing surprising that COVID-19 has come up. It was something that could have been predicted. In my past life, before becoming a kind of academic, I was a practitioner with the Rockefeller Foundation, and we have funded at the time many programs which dealt with cross-border transmission of virus from the 2000 to up to 2015, which were related to the same area of Southeast Asia and China. And that was, we have seen the SARS epidemic, we have seen the avian influenza epidemic, the SARS is another coronavirus, and we know that those viruses are coming out because of the encroachment of humans on the environment and the closeness with animals because of the rapid economic changes, including market integration. Again, if we don't address these links between economic, health, environment, etc., we will not be able to prevent future pandemic, because we are already saying now that this will not be the last pandemic that we are, while we are still not out, already we know that other viruses are developing at the same time. We have the paradigms, we have done work on this. There is eco-health approach, One Health approach. Now we talk about planetary health. These are all efforts to link these different aspects, but we lack the institutional structure. We still work in separate silos, especially in the academia, but also outside at the policy level. Now, the second element, which should be very logical, we are talking about behavioral change. Yeah? When we talk about prevention in relation of COVID-19, we depend on social intervention. These measures are universal in a certain way, like using the mask, social distance, etc., but they need to be contextualized. And here is where we are failing badly. We assume that everyone can work from home. We assume that everyone has water. We assume we are making a lot of assumption about the context in which people should apply this measure without really looking at the setting of in which people operate, and then ensure that they are able to apply this measure. And this again relates to what Gabriele said about blaming. So it's not individual behavior that we are interested in necessarily, but what are the setting, what are the conditions that enable them to apply this measure. In the case of Singapore and Thailand, it's also important to notice that there are public health is not neutral. There are very strong biases. And we have seen this in the case of migrants. Both in Singapore and Thailand, there was an overlooking of the conditions in which migrants live and now have been blamed for spreading the virus, while actually it's the condition in which they live that are responsible for their infection. The third is about statistical literacy. Now we hear every day about the numbers. These are the numbers, the most recent number for Southeast Asia, but what they really mean. What it means that Indonesia has so many people dying. We don't know how many people are tested. We don't know, again, the context of many of these numbers. So we are comparing countries, we are comparing conditions without even knowing that countries have different way. For instance, Thailand would do very little testing. They will put people under observation. If they get better in 14 years, well, it's done. They are not counted as infection. And you can see why Thailand has such a low number of infections. So it's not only because of the pandemic, but it's also because of the way these infections are counted. But again, we don't give enough attention to the analysis. We don't try to understand where the epidemic is happening in Europe, in other countries. There has been quite a lot of work on, for instance, multi-spreading events. What are the conditions for that? What are in particular, to try to understand how the epidemic move around. But in our case, for our region, still this work of transmission setting is still very poor, while actually we have indication of some of this. For instance, in Thailand, clearly the dance, the casino have played a role, which is quite interesting in comparison to other countries. The fourth, again, this related to what has been said. We know from the HIV/AIDS epidemic already that blaming the people that are already scared is never a good idea. If you start to blame people, if you start to make them afraid, they will not go to the hospital when they have symptoms. Now here I want to link to culture also. In Indonesia, for instance, we know that the first things you do if you have some cold symptom is get a massage from your family member. So if you read the story of people whose family have become infected, in spite of the knowledge of COVID-19, the first things they would do is try to find some solution within the household with touching, because massage, of course, implies touching. So it's not surprising that by the time all the symptoms are blown up, we are not talking anymore about one member, but we are talking about 4 or 5 members of the household that are infected. And unfortunately, we know, like for instance, recently, if the wife died before and then the husband after a few days. But if you read the accounts of people, most of the time they will try to avoid to go to the hospital, which is quite normal phenomena, but in the case of course, this pandemic is not helpful. So again, this approach is not only from a human rights perspective, but it's also not going to help in the prevention and containment of the epidemic. We also forget the very important part of emotions. Yeah. We do talk about trauma. We are aware that, of course, we know that people, when they are buried, for instance, without being able to be there, the family, this creates even more trauma than normally is the case. But still, there is basically no policy, no service, no other way of really addressing this very important aspect. So also finding substitute or finding alternative of how to address this lack of closeness that we are experiencing every day. So we say it's important, but then we don't do nothing about. The sixth and last topic is maybe the largest at this point. More and more we are aware that inequities, this pandemic expose inequity. If you look at this fall in wage in Cambodia, you see very clearly the one that are losing the most salaries or wage are the informal worker, in this case, entertainment, sex worker, hospitality and service worker, and then construction worker, and then the one that are employed formally have somewhat less reduction of salary, although they too lose their job, reduce the hours, etc. But you can see a big difference in the way the epidemic affects formal and informal workers. Yet social protection programs are all devoted mostly to formal workers. So we are leaving out a large percentage, because we know in Southeast Asia, most of the workers, a very large portion of the workers are informal, and for them there are only some kind of relief measure whenever they are available, but for sure not in a structured manner. The amount of money devoted for social protection is actually also across countries extremely different. Look at Singapore. Of course, we know Singapore is among the richest country of the world. Compared to Myanmar before, of course, the coup, you can see the big difference in what, while the need in Myanmar are probably even bigger than the one in Singapore. Even with country at the same level, you see big difference. There we see the political will in terms of giving or not giving social protection and the importance of social protection. So what to do is the action for an alternative future. Again, we cannot just address COVID as a medical case. People are suffering not only for the medical impacts, but also for the economic, social, existential impact. We need to do more to ensure that we create sustainable system. So sustainable from an environmental perspective as well as from an economic perspective. Discuss more about much needed social protection mechanism, and even more important in the long-term redistribution measure to reduce this inequity. The inequities are not because the pandemic, but they are made more because of the pandemic, but they are already pre-existing the pandemic. So if we want to address, we really need to deal with this. There is the whole issue of securitization. I don't have time to go into that, but I am sure some of my other speakers will talk about this. It's a very important point that COVID-19 is being used to silence opposition, to silence democratization process, like is the case in Thailand, yeah? That people are being persecuted. But ironically, even in Myanmar, the president, the former president, is being accused of not having observed COVID-19 measure, which of course is an excuse. And the time is now. We cannot just expect. We are confronted now with the issue of COVID-19, of the vaccine for COVID-19. This is is not, again, only an health issue, it's a political, economic issue. We are not advocating enough to insist that COVID vaccine is a public good. Philippines and Indonesia, here the news today about Indonesia is going to allow the sale of vaccine, saying there is no problem, it's a way to contribute to the government and to resource. It's not as simple as that. We are going to have double standard, the Chinese vaccine given to the general population and the better vaccine for those who can afford. And of course, it's a question of competition of scarce resources. If they can sell, of course, we'll take it away from somewhere else. Of course, the government is saying no problem, they are going to take care, this is not going to happen, but the reality is going to be very different. At the same time, we have alternatives like we had in the HIV/AIDS, and they worked for HIV/AIDS. We are not discussing enough the issue of compulsory licensing of patents, the right to patents. This is something that government could do rather than run to sell vaccine through the private sector. There is a movement for TRIPS waiver option initiated by India and South Africa. But where is Southeast Asia? Why we don't hear our voice from people living in this area? And we buy into the commercialization of health in such a way that we are no longer interested, like in the 90s, to really challenge. At the moment, at the time, and I link it here with the condition of civil society at this moment of time, which in my view is much weakened when you compare with what happened in the 90s for the AIDS epidemic. Now, the final, I want to end with, again, going back to the same time. So while we act now, because there is an urgency to address vaccine, to address the sale of medicine, to address the right to health insurance and social protection. These are short-term measures, but we cannot forget, again, in conclusion, that the most important consequence of seeing COVID is underlying its social origin. Unless government devise program, and us, of course, we need to push for such program that address the disparity, the way we are dealing with the environment, the way we are dealing with economic system, we will not be able to resolve this crisis, because this crisis, again, is a syndemic, it's more than one system falling apart. So we really need to work to address all this system at the same time. It is time for revival, or some would say revolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ibu Rosalia, for the critical insight and inspiring presentation. I will continue our panel session by reading the short curriculum vitae of Ko Ying Hoi. She will present Southeast Asia's pandemic, politics and human rights, trends and lessons. Dr. Ko Ying Hoi is the head and senior lecturer at the Department of International and Strategic Studies in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, University of Malaya. She has research interests that include civil society, social movements, human rights, and democratization, particularly in Southeast Asia and ASEAN, especially Malaysia and Timor-Leste. She is also active as a columnist, the regional consultant, and also journal editor. So I will invite our second honorable speaker, Dr. Ko Ying Hoi. Time is yours.
Thank you, Natalia. Hello, everyone. So I'll be presenting this topic from the human rights approach in looking at the pandemic in Southeast Asia. So basically, it has been over a year since we lived together with COVID-19 as we welcome the year of 2021. The situation unfortunately remains grim with the border closures continues in most part of the world. So this is in spite of the rapid productions and now the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines. As of today, as Ibu Liam showed, in the statistic, the Southeast Asia region recorded more than 2 million of COVID-19 cases, with Indonesia ranked the highest, and followed by the Philippines, Malaysia, Myanmar, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Brunei, Laos, and Timor-Leste. So Southeast Asia is generally characterized very often by this trend of the authoritarian or partial democratic governments with issues such as inequality, inadequate social protection, and regression in the independent institutions. As I wrote in the LSE blog on 1st October 2020, I've mentioned that the health crisis is affording the regimes with the authoritarian tendency the opportunity to actually further suppress the political dissents with and consolidate their power. How leaders and their citizens are actually interacting with one another during the pandemic could also provide some clues to the future exercise of power. As a researcher who also look into the protest trends in the region, since last year, we witnessed several protests that have been erupted in the Southeast Asia region itself, such as in Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, Cambodia, and currently in Myanmar, in the midst of the COVID-19. In Thailand, beginning first as demonstrations against the government of Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha, it later on included the unprecedented demands for reform of the Thai monarchy. In Indonesia, we witnessed the protesters from various groups due to their anger over the omnibus law, which was introduced by the Indonesian government in the House of Representatives in early 2020. In the Philippines, we see Filipinos protest against a new anti-terrorism bill, and in Cambodia, the demonstration was being held to denounce the arrest of the union leader and human rights activist Rong Chun, and several sporadic protests is still ongoing in Cambodia itself, in addition to other activists, of course, who were reportedly arrested for criticizing the government. And also in Cambodia, they have the draft public order that triggered the debates, as it contains the broad and arbitrary provisions which violate the international human rights law and the Cambodia's own constitutions. The recent Myanmar protests held in opposition to the military coup, all of these protests are triggered by similar trends of the governmental orientations that tends toward the securitizations and militarizations. Although through the various methods, although at this point of time, I could not claim that the actions of these governments take place only by taking advantage of the COVID-19, but there are established instances of its linkages. In the region, we see the use of the technology for contact tracing that raises several ambiguity between the protections of the individual rights and the collective right to health. It also resonates with the restrictions of civil liberties, such as freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and freedom of information. Moreover, as we witness, due to the limitation in the governance capacity, the pandemic exacerbates the inequitable public health system, as well as the social inequalities in a region where there's a large informal sector and a weak social protection systems. So all these inequities particularly have affected vulnerable populations, as exemplified by migrant and refugees communities who suffer lack of regional solidarities and the repressive policies. And in facing these authoritarian trends, the populations rely basically on localized, confidential, or invisible forms of the regulations, as a transparency of the data and so forth are really not 100% there. And the indexes coming from different organizations such as the Economist Intelligence Unit, Democracy Index, WordPress Freedom, and the Civicus State of Civil Society report related to the civic space on the issues such as the freedom of assembly and so forth have shown that basically the response and the management of the COVID-19 across the region has varied, but it generally reflects that the region is experiencing government that are increasingly assertive in showing authoritarian governance. So if we examine all these issues, we can see as raised by the International Center for Non-for-Profit, ICNL COVID-19 Civic Freedom Tracker, the questions of how democracy can deliver has become one of the leading challenges in our time. The problem is, as we witness in many countries, democratic institutions that are in place are often weak and ineffective in terms of the practice of it, apart from under the name of a democratic country. Nevertheless, I must say that at this point of time, it is rather premature, although there are several studies that have come out with from different perspectives to claim that to make any conclusion of the direct correlation as to how democratic or how open a country is in its effectiveness in managing the pandemic. So back then, I summarized 6 trends as I observed in the practice of human rights and democracy in the region. The first trend is the inward-looking approach. However, since then, we see there's a few mechanisms that are coming out from the ASEAN itself, although there are many of the Southeast Asian countries are still practicing on its own way of managing the pandemic. And the second trend is the authoritarian approach adopted by most countries in Southeast Asia, as I elaborated just now. And the third trend is the militarization approach that has linkages with the mentioned securitization approach. And the fourth trend is the limitation in governance capacity, which I will elaborate more later, where the pandemic revealed the serious gaps in the public health governance. This included the lack of the pandemic preparedness and the response, and the lack of the coordinations coming from the government agency. For instance, in Malaysia itself, there's a lot of attentions that putting into the Ministry of Health itself, but whereby the pandemics is a responsibility cutting across of all the government agencies in the country. And this reveals that the problems of the human rights and the fifth, the pandemic has exposed glaring inequalities in the region itself, where we see the economic distributions that is imbalanced, whereby it reveals that the problem of human rights in this region is not mainly civil and political rights, but the economic, social, and cultural rights have also been neglected. So, and sixth trend is the technology with a focus on the contact tracing apps and the transparency of the information. Interestingly, in a recent book that I co-edited and just launched on the 4th February, entitled Southeast Asia, Infected and Interrupted, Elevating Critical Voices on the State of Human Rights and Peace in the Time of COVID-19, initiated by the Strengthening Human Rights and Peace Research and Education in Southeast Asia, ASEAN, by SHAPE-C. We received more than 100 articles. However, the selected 72 articles in this book that represent voices coming from the 11 Southeast Asian countries resonates with the trends as observed. And for instance, a number of Southeast Asian countries such as Cambodia and Thailand have used the pandemic to justify stricter laws that impacted on the exercise of human rights. Similarly, for the Philippines, where the new anti-terrorism law, as I mentioned just now, that's sending a chilling message to human rights groups. As in the countries like Singapore and Malaysia, we have been having the issues with the treatment with the migrant workers, refugees, and so forth. And along these lines, some of the pieces in that book also highlight some issues that are not in the limelight in most of the media and receive little attentions. For instance, the impacts on different groups of women and children, including as narrow as, for instance, how about the women workers in the factories, the pregnant ladies, and so forth in certain parts of the countries. And The availability of the information and the accessibility of technology is another concern that is commonly shared by some authors in that book, and it has been a challenge in the region. And I think Ibu Lia also mentioned about how transparent are the information that being informed to the public, and whether are the numbers that provided to us is the right numbers that actually how they actually conduct the tracing and so forth. So the pandemic basically reveals the weakness of some countries in terms of the healthcare, such as Indonesia and the Philippines, as well as the danger that it has on the frontline workers. And contribution in that book also reaffirmed the thesis of many academics and observers, including what I've wrote in the LSC blog, that COVID-19 has been a real challenge for all the different stakeholders, and there have been a strong arguments that the directions of the human rights and democracy amidst the pandemic has not been encouraging. So what then can be the alternative solutions in facing COVID-19 across the Southeast Asia? I must say that I do not exactly have the alternative solutions. Rather, it is old stories, but I think it is old stories where people tend to speak about it, but hardly taking any actions with it, which I look at it from the perspective of human rights. So moving forward, first, my recommendation would be the pandemic brought out the best and the worst in terms of how the duty bearers, particularly the states, on how they manage the crisis. I think the emphasis on the states being the duty bearers have been not too much being highlighted in the media and so forth, that they have the duty, and but also the multiple and intersecting human conditions as well, in pursuit of the right-centered governance plans and policy that should respond appropriately to the different needs. It is a key that the duty bearers are reminded of their mandates towards a human rights and peace-embracing region, with several points such as the state responses before, during, and after the emergency situation should respect and protect human rights principles. The policies and plans, which many countries are drafting and some have been drafted, should reflect the diverse needs and the lived conditions of all. And I think one of the discussion now we have is who should receive the vaccines first. And the different countries have the different approach on who should be prioritized. I think the next issue that we maybe should discuss is about the prioritizations when it comes to the vaccination. And apart from that, duty bearers, also the other things is that the business sectors that should also be put accountable in this whole global pandemics of their responsibilities as well. And the use of technology should benefit even those who have difficulty accessing the online platforms such as the internet. Furthermore, they should not infringe anyone's right to privacy. And second point, we need to advance the discourse of human rights and the power relations. In the pandemic, there's an emerging awareness that the governments must strike a fair balance between protecting and promoting public health on one side and individual human rights on the other. Human rights should then be integrated into the COVID-19 measures decision process. So such integration, however, will not be possible without the human rights awareness, knowledge, and accessibility. As we know, the impact of the human rights actors in this region is very much context dependent. That is, it depends upon the political, economic, and social context. In the Southeast Asian region, it is significant that the conceptions of the human rights has been constantly challenged, and it somehow sustained particular forms of the power, especially coming from the top. This explains that how both concepts are thus playing a highly ambivalent role. First and foremost is the duty of to protect, respect, and fulfill the right to life, including the basic healthcare. States that do not implement the measures against the disease will be in violations of this human rights duty. In the Southeast Asian region, where very often the governments treat the notions of the human rights as an adversary rather than a duty, the pandemic has opened up this discourse of human rights and power relation that send a message where the governments are responsible for fulfilling the human rights, and thus also for introducing the right tools for decision makers and implementers. This is where what the human rights civil societies and civil society should build on, and to activate such discourse to bring in the awareness of the role of the states, and that civil and political rights are compatible with the economic, social, and cultural rights. While promoting the right to life and health, states must align these measures with other human rights obligations, especially civil and political rights. The right to privacy, freedom of movement, and other fundamental human rights have to be respected as far as possible. The COVID-19 teaches us there's a correlation between the economy and the perception of the democracy cannot be ignored, as there is no direct causal analysis between the two. Perception of democracy can be low while experiencing high economic growth. People who are dissatisfied with their own government's approaches in COVID-19 could include those either they want a more liberal approach and those who want a more autocratic responses. This has certainly posed a huge challenge for the pro-democracy and human rights groups in the future. So the battle is on ways to actually how to avoid this, and instead put forward alternative plans for recovery that can, among others, expand the rights and make economies fairer with the redistribution policy in place. Linking to the first proposed solution with a focus on the policy, as we face the challenges of restricted policy in place that potentially constrain the full function of human rights. For me, in short, it is important that a full account of human rights should include such considerations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ying Hoi, for your critical insight in your presentation. For all participants, please don't hesitate to send your question in the chat box during our panel session. Now I will invite our third honorable speaker from Australia, Dr. Ian Douglas Wilson. He will present local system of regulation suburban case of rooted solidarities in Jakarta, Indonesia. Dr. Ian Wilson is a senior lecturer in politics and terrorism and counterterrorism, Murdoch University, Australia. He is also academic chair of the Global Security Program and joins the Asia Research Center. His research focuses on Indonesian politics and society, particularly the political economy of organized crime, vigilantism, street authority, and political violence. He also collaborates with a lot of organizations and institutions in research projects and consultancies. I will invite our third honorable speaker, Dr. Ian Wilson. Time is yours.
Right. Thanks very much, Natalia. I feel slightly intimidated by only having 15 minutes to talk about such a detailed subject with sufficient depth. So you'll excuse me if I talk through pretty rapidly to try and make a couple of key points that we can hopefully discuss. So as many have commentated, COVID-19 has really exposed and exacerbated existing inequalities within and between societies. Globally, the poor, of course, have been hit hard by the pandemic through the intertwined risks of greater susceptibility and exposure to infection and poor health outcomes, combined with the social and economic impacts of various containment measures implemented by government. In particular, some of the policing of informal street economies has had significant impacts on that front. They also now face delays and problems of inaccessibility to vaccines, both in the context of global South and global North power dynamics and the hoarding of vaccines by richer countries, as well as deep class inequalities within societies. Now, moving to the case of Indonesia, which is what I wanted to focus on today. Indonesia, as of this week, has recorded 1.23 million cases of COVID-19. It's the highest in the region, with over 34,000 deaths. And there's unfortunately little to suggest at this time that the worst has yet to pass, with the pandemic by no means under control. The socio-economic impacts of COVID-19 have also been immense, and we saw, just as I was preparing for today, the Badan Pusat Statistik estimating probably very conservatively that poverty levels have increased by at least 10% in the past quarter, linked explicitly to the conditions of the pandemic, and Indonesia has officially entered into recession. Now, this has led at focusing on, and I've had a longer term interest in urban politics, focusing on Jakarta, some very interesting counter patterns to sort of decades long trends. And in particular, we've seen shifts in trends of rural to urban migration. And since the beginning of the pandemic, certainly in the case of Jakarta, increased numbers of the opposite direction of city to rural migration, as people have returned to villages due to either a lack of work, through processes of what you could call virtually deindustrialization with the shutting down of some manufacturing industries, as well as relative safe spaces from virus risk. Now, this has also had sort of converse impacts, such as an increase of in-city influxes, not of those seeking work has been the longer-term trend, but of those seeking hospitalization and medical care in larger cities. And we saw just a couple of weeks ago, the governor of Jakarta requesting that the national government intervene, faced with the situation that 87% of Jakarta's hospital beds are now full with COVID cases, and around a quarter of those are from people coming from outside of Jakarta, often from rural areas where there's insufficient health services. Now, analysts such as Rebecca Meckelbird and Sharon Pambal, my former colleagues here at Murdoch, have argued that in the case of Indonesia, COVID-19 responses and impacts have been fragmented and operated on varying scales. So with variations and tensions, often very significant ones, between national, subnational, as well as local and informal grassroots responses. And these have often reflected various, often competing interests of varying groups who have harnessed different kinds of institutions and resources at different levels and scales of government to often either forward or to defend their respective agendas and interests. And these have been both economic and social, and also in terms of their exposures to vulnerability and risk. So starting at the top, for a national government that's deeply embedded in oligarchic interests, this has resulted in a prioritizing of particularist economic interests over and above more pressing public health goods, something that we've all observed in the case of Indonesia from the very start of this pandemic, including some quite shocking denialism in the early stages, which meant there was a very slow off-the-block start at the national level. Now, this hasn't been a uniform approach, and we've seen in Indonesia more broadly at lower levels of government, and I would suggest this is perhaps partly due to the fact that lower levels of government are often more focused on addressing more everyday concerns of constituents and of local populations. There have been some relatively competent responses, though again, this has varied quite widely. Now, government inaction, particularly in providing effective and accessible health services, and now as we're seeing in the rolling out of vaccines and vaccinations in Indonesia, has pushed many towards the market with so-called user pay approaches and outcomes. And as Rosalia mentioned before, we've seen the recently floated proposal by Indonesia's health minister, that's Budi Sadikin. And it's probably worth noting as a health minister, his history is he's a former banker. So it's perhaps not surprising he's brought this logic to bear in his new public role of allowing private firms and the rich to jump the queue in the national COVID vaccination queue. Now, for the poor, and the urban poor in particular, is what I want to focus on for the rest of my presentation today. Market-based solutions are, of course, a socio-economic disaster and are neither tenable nor accessible, and often manifest as highly disruptive to already precarious lives and livelihoods, or in the case of a public health emergency such as this, manifest in forms of abject negligence by the state. So a marked feature overall has been significant tensions, if not a complete disjuncture, between national, subnational, and also informal and grassroots pandemic responses. Now, my argument today as such is a relatively simple one, and I'll try and give a specific example from a case study of a neighbourhood I've done fieldwork in the past. And the argument is simply that local grassroots efforts among the urban poor and organising and mobilisation, albeit very fragmented and patchy, has been utterly crucial in mitigating many of the impacts of the spread of COVID-19 and keeping some of the country's most vulnerable afloat during the pandemic. I'll add to that simply that that's not a new thing, but it's based in existing practices and strategies of everyday survival and everyday politics of the urban poor to face numerous risks and vulnerabilities. And this is, of course, just the latest risk that people face. In the context of Jakarta, that's everything from the seasonal risks of natural disaster, from flooding that people are experiencing right now, to a host of other diseases, as well as economic precarity. A longer project that I've had, and that wasn't mentioned in my introductory CV, was a joint project on the political agency of the poor. It was a collaborative project with my colleagues Jane Hutchison and Professor Caroline Hughes, where we looked at the cases of Indonesia, the Philippines, and Cambodia. And we tried to identify, using a structural political economy approach and a social relational approach to understanding poverty, what we could identify as the strategies of the urban poor as political actors, remembering that in many characterizations of the poor, they're seen as bereft of political agency. And we've argued that there is a very distinct politics of the poor that's produced by the structural relations of power that define poverty itself. And I'll just identify quickly, again, I have to overgeneralize because I don't have time to do otherwise, but some of those features, and then link that back to finish off through the example of a particular neighbourhood, which has been a success story, I would argue, in the case of urban poor protecting themselves in lieu of the state from the risks of COVID-19. Now, the nature of precarious livelihoods means that the urban poor are required to keep diverse ranges of options open and pursue very multiple, improvised, and often very contradictory approaches and opportunities to both hedge their risks, to their livelihoods and security. And one of the features that we've tried to do in our typology of sort of the political agency of the urban poor is of multiplicity, that multiplicities of relationships, often ideologically incoherent relationships, so that ideology is not a defining feature of these relationships, but various strategic alignments and multiple possibilities that are seen as necessary as hedging against the risks that come with being poor. And this is often at the expense of pursuing strategies that involve, for example, coherent ideology or an organizational or collective focus, which is more traditionally associated with, say, working class politics through trade unionism and shared workplaces. And we've looked at informal economies have great difficulty in these forms of organizational approach. So this has meant, in the context of the pandemic, that urban poor communities have been very structurally highly vulnerable, but also in some respects socially relatively well equipped. And I have to caveat that by saying in relations of power where they are deeply disadvantaged to face some of the risks associated with COVID-19. Now, in this typology of the political agency of the urban poor, we've identified four main areas. The first is what we call the everyday, and that's the pragmatic politics of redress, where the poor are forced by the nature of the social relations that constitute poverty to seek their own solutions to various problems, from the quiet encroachment that Asif Bayat and others have talked about in establishing communities in lieu of having formal land title, through to the various atomized actions of everyday life to forge livelihoods in hostile environments. The second is the defensive. So when people defend their immediate and tangible interests on a local scale, that can be resisting eviction. It can be often quite confrontational through acts of violence in some cases. And we've seen this in the pandemic in the context of Jakarta, where the poor have sought to try and negotiate the policing of protocols, COVID protocols, which, as many of you be aware, in the case of Indonesia, has involved the police and often quite militaristic and securitized approaches that have disproportionately affected the urban poor who make livelihoods from street economies. The other aspect of urban poor politics that we identify is what we call the disruptive, which is when the poor start to think differently about their circumstances and identities and seek to attempt to disrupt existing power relationships rather than manoeuvring within them as a part of everyday survival strategies. And the fourth, and I'll finish on that before looking at a specific example, is what we refer to as multiple strategies and multiple relationships. So again, the nature of precarious livelihoods means that poor people have to keep their options open. They must pursue multiple opportunities to hedge risk. They have multiple patrons and often advocates who may demand loyalty, but the poor are more likely to invest heavily in multiple relationships. So that could be with a progressive NGO, it could be with political parties, it could be with religious reactionaries, it could be with the police, it could be with local gangsters, it could be with all of those things, all those actors at the same time. And that managing these relationships is often extremely complex and forms part of what we argue is a unique political agency of the poor, and one in which poor people often prioritize personalized relations over contracts or even the assertion of rights. Now, to apply this very briefly at the end to a particular case, I wanted to look at the neighborhood known as Kampung Aquarium in North Jakarta. It's a neighborhood where I spent a considerable amount of time up until the end of 2019. And it's an interesting case for a number of reasons, but one in particular in the context of the pandemic in Jakarta is that to this point in time, there's only been one case of COVID-19 in the community. And this is in the context of North Jakarta, where surrounding areas where there's high concentrations of poor populations, in Penjaringan in particular, which based on official statistics, which are more than likely a significant underestimate, there's been over 6,500 cases and multiple deaths, and also in Pademangan, which is also borders Kampung Aquarium, with a relatively high proportion of cases. Now, in trying to explain why that's the case, I've sort of tried to return to some of these characteristics of urban poor politics and the specifics of Kampung Aquarium. By way of a very brief background, Kampung Aquarium was evicted and the neighbourhood was destroyed in around 2016 by Ahok when he was governor. This became a source of resistance from the community. They squatted on their previous land and refused to move. In the context of the broader machinations, national politics mobilising against Ahok, which turned into the Islamist 212 movement, the residents of Aquarium were drawn into broader networks in which their localised defence of their community became intertwined with what became essentially national politics. And what this meant was that a local struggle of the urban poor, they formed multiple sets of relationships, often quite exploitative ones, with political parties, including presidential candidates such as Prabowo Subianto, Islamist groups such as the Front Pembela Islam, but also an array of progressive organisations such as Rujak, Centre for Urban Studies, who have assisted them in trying to, what has been actually a great outcome, where they're now having their community rebuilt by the city administration of Jakarta. So in trying to explain why I think this has been a success story in terms of the relative low levels of COVID-19 infection in the context of that area, which has high concentrations of the urban poor, where there have been very poor outcomes, I've identified a couple of things. And this is, I should say, very speculative. Of course, I can't go to Indonesia, so I'm basing this on ongoing conversations with residents there via WhatsApp and other forums. One is that there's high levels of social solidarity and organisation that have developed as in the context of this longer protracted political struggle, their housing struggle, which has meant in comparison to other neighbourhoods, there's high levels of organisation, and this resulted in the context of COVID-19 with a very quick early response. So from April last year, they had engaged in forms of self-quarantine, where they were monitoring who was coming and going from their own neighbourhood. They had self-education campaigns in conjunction with some of their progressive allies in NGOs to encourage personal hygiene. and social distancing as much as that's possible in that context. They also drew on extensive networks of patronage and support from their previous political struggle, including political parties that were keen to have publicity stunt giving of gifts and support, and also a relatively good relationship with the regional government, because they'd been fundamental to the electing of the governor of Jakarta, Anies Baswedan. There was also very good forms of collective organisation and education, which have been largely absent from many other communities, where fragmentation and atomised struggles have still defined the political realities of the urban poor. So in conclusion, and I'm assuming I have no time left, I haven't looked at the time as such, I should mention there's also environmental factors, that one of the strange ironies of having their neighbourhood demolished and then living in temporary accommodation is that they actually have a much more spacious and well-ventilated living area than many of the surrounding districts, which suffer from very poor sanitation, a lack of running water, etc., that their temporary living circumstances actually afforded them better circumstances. So this is just sort of one example I wanted to put out there as an example of urban poor using these particular kinds of strategies and relationships to negotiate the risks of COVID-19. In this case, and it's only one case, of course, in the, relatively successfully, is that they've managed to not have significant outbreaks and people have managed to survive economically. So in conclusion, the pandemic, of course, has highlighted existing inequalities and the limited capacity and will of government in responding to the social, economic and health needs of large sections of, certainly in the case of Indonesia, of urban society. And it has highlighted, again, the ongoing issues faced by the urban poor, inadequate housing, inadequate access to public infrastructure, economic insecurity, and access to adequate health services. In the context of this, self-initiated organising, grassroots mobilisation and existing networks of solidarity and support have been utterly crucial for surviving this unprecedented public health crisis. I'm very careful not to fetishise this kind of survival strategy, because it's something that people are forced to do in lieu of the absence and utter failure, institutional failure of higher levels of government. But it does constitute, I think, an important level of local level self-organisation and resilience that can be, in conjunction with state resources, part of more effective strategies for managing this public health crisis. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ian, for your enlightening presentation. We will have a discussion session, so please keep your energy and your question after panel session. Now we arrive at our last panel speakers, Gabriel Fakal, Gloria Truly Estrelita, and Sarah Andrew. Gabriel and Sarah will present what interests for Indonesian social movement in facing authoritarian responses. Gabriel Fakal is an anthropologist of Centre du Sud-Est et Général Paris, Institut de Recherche Asiatique and Patrimoine Locaux, Environnement et Globalisation, IRD, MNHN Paris. He has interest in ritual initiation, martial arts, customary authority, ancestry, political and religious violence, and popular resistance. Gabriel is also the founder of Altercy and the convener of this program. Similar to Gabriel, Gloria Truly Estrelita is the founder of Altercy. She is a historian in Centre du Sud-Est et Général Paris. Her work is related to the themes of religion in prison, particularly in the Asian carceral system. She has experience working at the Center for Criminological Studies in Indonesia. Currently, she is a PhD student at the IHS Paris. And Sarah Andrew is the co-founder of Altercy. She has interest in cultural and heritage politics, particularly regarding traditional practices in Indonesia, such as Sundanese wayang golek or traditional puppet, considering its identity, mythical heritage, and political dimension. In 2020, she started the new research about religious alternative groups, New Age, and atheism in Indonesia. So, I will invite our third honorable speakers, Dr. Gabriel and Dr. Sarah. Time is yours.
Thank you so much for technical matter, for technical comfort. We wanted to share our screen so we can read a PowerPoint. Shall I do that, or do you want to read it yourself, Romulo or Natalia?
You can do by yourself if you want, but if we can also share.
I will try to do this.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Good morning and good afternoon. In this contribution, Gabriel Facal, Gloria Trulli Estrelita, and myself, Sarah Anaïs Andrieux, will do a brief presentation of the social movement's possibilities to act and make their voice heard in the current Indonesian context. In the archipelago, the definition of civil society is complex. It is a recent notion that was shaped through various historical phases. Ford and Dibley point 4 periods in the last decades. During the authoritarian regime of President Suharto, that lasted from 1966 until 1998 and was called the New Order, the government achieved a more or less complete demobilization of society.
I'm sorry, I was told that the PowerPoint doesn't run well.
Or maybe I can ask Romulo. Romulo, can you share the presentation, please? Thank you.
Okay. Here we go. Okay, please.
Good afternoon. In this contribution, Gabriel Facal, Gloria Trulli Estrelita, and myself, Sarah Andrieux, will do a brief presentation of the social movement's possibilities to act and make their voice heard in the current Indonesian context. In the archipelago, the definition of civil society is complex. It is a recent notion that was shaped through various historical phases. Ford and Dibley point 4 periods in the last decades. During the authoritarian regime of President Suharto, that lasted from briefly 1966 until 1998, that was called the New Order, the government achieved a more or less complete demobilization of society. It reordered the political system and entrenched a series of functional groups for workers, peasants, fishers, youth, and women to contain the participation of constituencies formerly represented by independent social movements, as presented in Reeve in 1985. For the next 3 decades, activists were forced to mobilize in fragmented and transitory pockets of a political space through a kaleidoscope of small NGOs, action committees, and informal networks. In 1998, during the fall of the regime, the pro-democracy coalition consisted primarily of students supported by academics, NGO activists, and middle-class women's groups, as well as some members of the political and religious elite. After the first years of democratization, in Ford and Dibley's terms, democratic stagnation has affected social attitudes and political opportunity structures related to particular areas of concern. End of quote. This period resulted in a mixed response of social movements. In this diachronic course, civil society was shaped by several socio-political factors that may also be considered as limits. First, it is strongly influenced by the client-patron model that shapes the social and political arenas. The family pattern and Bapaism that was extendedly implemented during the New Order period, with its hierarchical organization and its solidarities, are also reflected in the religious communities and in politics. Religion and politics are themselves interconnected, for example, in the notion of sovereignty and authority, but also through interpersonal dependencies. The clientelist pattern encompasses the economic sector and the states. It is illustrated by the integration in the cabinet of big entrepreneurs and by government alliances with political tycoons possessing the media. Another factor that shapes civil society is the penetration of uncivil elements through vigilante groups that are composed of civilians and are often patronized by retired members from the army and police. These counter-movements also concern lobbying groups co-opted by political players, particularly during electoral campaigns. They are also partly led by the government, for instance, through the cyber troops that operate to saturate social media. In parallel, uncivil elements penetrate the government itself through a high proportion of ex-military and police officers with illiberal agendas, some of them being also prominent businessmen. In addition to these historical structural legacies, the current president, Joko Widodo, has engaged an authoritarian term. Since the beginning of his first mandate in 2014, he progressively transformed the notion of social contract at the foundation of democracy by positioning himself as a hyper-president with a highly personalized decision-making capacity concerning public problems, through procedures that Herlambang Wiratmans labels as autocratic legalism. He responded to the opposition assaults expressed through Islamic pressures by manipulating the long-lasting division and polarization between Muslim groups, nationalist factions, and pro-democracy segments. He also included much of the opposition within his successive cabinets. In parallel, the government issued several fundamental laws without any civil consultation, such as the KPK law in 2019, which is about the Commission about the Eradication of Corruption, and in 2020, the MIGAS law about mineral resources, MK law about the Constitutional Court, and the Omnibus law, or the work law in 2020. This strategy was coupled with a high degree of repression in the street and the social media. Jokowi also operates a militarization of civil society through a program called Bela Negara that aims to train civilians militarily. This program is supposed to be implemented in campuses and to shape a patriotic character, as well as to recruit spare components for the national army. Finally, the government fosters a media campaign to devaluate opposition narratives, for example through the control of pretended hoaxes. In complement, the supportive media overcover the contesting forces that don't have any systemic or cross-sectional demands. At the same time, the government hires social media influencers to spread propaganda contents or orient the opinion tendencies within the population. At the end of 2020, the Indonesian archipelago remained at the top of the list of Southeast Asian countries with the highest number of COVID-19 cases. It also suffered an economic recession for the first time in 2 decades. The government created the Satgas Penanganan COVID-19, or the Task Force for Handling with COVID-19, that became KCP-PAN in June 2020, or the Committee for Handling COVID-19 and National Economic Recovery. Besides the pervasive presence of police and army officers, it also implements the effective domination of economics over the health and social measures in dealing with the pandemics.
In this situation, scholars like Marcus Mitzner have analyzed that the capacities for the Indonesian civil society resistance against democratic erosion have become weaker. An important movement emerged in 2019 that was coordinated by students and labor unions. It gained a growing systematization of the demands expressed in the ecological realm and for the defense of peasant communities, in the contestation of the opponent's criminalization, in the focus on anti-corruption and anti-clientelism, or in the support of workers' rights. It also developed cumulative modes of action through publications, meetings, marches, demonstrations, petitions, lobbying, and threats to intervene directly in formal political life.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Gabriel and Dr. Sarah.
Actually, it's not finished, but it sounds that there were many problems with the reading of the PowerPoint. So we are very sorry for the inconvenience.
Oh. Will you continue your presentation or?
I think that, yeah, maybe I can do like a brief, more brief presentation because it's already quite long. So maybe I will talk only on the social movements. So we were talking about the two kind of social movements. The first, it was an important movement that emerged in 2019. That was a massive protest. And the second kind of social movements were more fragmented, anchored and routinized forms in the form of self-organized groups and networks of solidarity. This movement didn't achieve to significantly influence the polls for the regional elections, but they had several successes. They achieved to reinforce sovereignty and autonomy over the control of the nexus production, distribution, consumption, for example, through the development of microeconomy networks and by making possible the free distribution of local agrarian products. Some built alternative information and communication channels. They monitored public decisions regarding the sanitary policies, and they helped their fellow citizens to adopt sanitary measures in general by pointing out the continuities between environmental problems, production incoherence, social inequalities, political corruption or incompetence, economic failure, and the sanitary situation. They participate to render intelligible the systemic dimension of the public problems. So what are the possible developments for social movements in the context of this epidemic? First, if the crisis isn't solved within the next few months, one can expect the tensions to intensify, social movements to radicalize, and the authoritarian disposals to reinforce, for example, through an increased power delegated to Prabowo Subianto and the military police apparatus. In turn, if the crisis resolves thanks to improvements in the vaccine campaign and medicine impacts, the social movements could resolve either, or at the contrary, they could continue their efforts to implement structural changes in favor of the reduction of inequalities and social injustice and to improve public services and civil rights. Then, after Jokowi's mandate in 2024, it's possible that the camp of the president will be severely weakened due to the disappointment of his initial supporters and multiplication of the opposition forces. Prabowo Subianto or any other authoritarian figure are already competed by the authoritarian stance of Jokowi, and this stance is seriously criticized among a large portion of the population. Regarding Islamic figures, they will hardly find the same boost as in 2016 because the current problem is not merely perceived in moral, but in economic terms. Then the more probable scenario is the rise of a liberal figure believed to have the capacity to rebuild the economic foundations of the country, for example, Sandiaga Uno or Nadiem Makarim. Since these elites privilege corporations and private interests over public goods and practical arrangements over popular decisions, we can suppose that they will hardly fulfill the expectations of progressive social movements. Thank you so much for your attention. And sorry for the technical problems. I had myself many problems with the screen.
No problem. I thought it's a great presentation. Thank you, Gabriel and Dr. Sarah. Okay, today we are more enlightened about how the pandemic has consequences and try to think about alternative solution for better condition, I think. Okay, we arrived at the discussion sessions. If you want to deliver your question, we can discuss. We can start now. Maybe Truly, could you lead some of question, please? Or maybe we can start with someone who raised hand in here, Teresia Pratiwi. You can ask by yourself if you want. You can open your mute. Your mic, please. Teresia, can you hear us? Okay, maybe Truly, could you send some question? Or
Yes, thank you, Natalia. We have received several questions already, actually. First one, I think it's for Ibu Lia. I will read the question. With such mechanism of the military-supported government in place, is there any social movement in Thailand concerning the government's policy towards the pandemic? If yes, how the government reacts? So, okay, perhaps Ibu Lia can answer the question, please.
Do you want me to react, or you are going to read the other questions? No, just this.
Perhaps you can answer the question, and then I will read another question after your answer.
Okay, I think yes, there has been a discussion about the vaccine, and here I have to be very careful about framing correctly, because the company that has been entrusted with the vaccine is basically under the Privy Council, and so related to royal powers. The opposition has questioned the choice, and now, of course, there is danger of accusation of lèse-majesté, which is quite a serious crime in the context of Thailand. So there is discussion about there have been also a lot of discussion about the policy that have been employed towards migrant workers. The second wave of infection in Thailand has been framed as starting from the migrant community in Samut Sakhon, while actually a few weeks before there were Thai sex workers who had come in from Myanmar, who had found infection. So the borders is not only one way, of course. Also Thai people are moving to other countries and coming back, but that is not projected in the narrative. And the second fact, which is also interesting, that the first person found infected in this fishing market was a Thai person, a Thai vendor. But nonetheless, because the number of migrants were much more than the Thai numbers, they were closed. Basically, they were not allowed to leave their dormitories. They used the so-called Singapore approach, but they let the Thai people come and go from outside Samut Sakhon, and of course they spread the epidemic in other parts. Up to these days, in many, because after the dormitory, many migrant workers were found infected in various factories. They are close in the factories. Whether they are infected or not, they're close together. They cannot go away. So clearly an approach that is not the same for the Thai population. Now about this, there has been a lot of discussion in the newspaper. Many Thai journalists and writers and organizations have taken side with the migrants and expose these double standards that have been used. The third, of course, is in the context of democratization. There are a lot of demonstrations, as you know, in these last months in Thailand, mostly from students, but also other parties. And these are not official, of course, are not allowed according to the COVID measure. There should not be a meeting of so many people crowding together, even if it is in the open air. But I think no one is really paying attention at the moment when this is happening, meaning they know about the risk, they use the mask, but they still think that their fight is more important than the risk. And of course, being young, their risk is somewhat lower than. So there has been a lot of criticism also of the use of the Thai government of this kind of measure when there was no local transmission according to the government. They still kept this emergency measure for many months going. Now they could be justified because there is a second wave. But before this, there was no infection according to the official story for many months, and still the measure remained in place. So like was said by Ying Oi, I mean, the link of the use of these measures with political reason is very close. So I think there is quite a lot of scrutiny of the government policy these days of COVID, especially this second wave is considered not to be. And the last point, sorry, I am talking a lot, but there is a lot to say about this. In terms of the relief measure that have been taken, and now the photograph I had in my presentation is just of this few days ago, you see hundreds of people that have to go to register because they don't have the phone, while the government asks them to use the phone. These are old people, poor people who are not familiar with this kind of communication, and the way the government has chosen is not suitable for this population. And this is the same mistake that was done in March and April. So in a sense, it's not a new approach, but the question is why it's still used, forcing people to crowd the bank and the office to register to get relief. Now, this again has got quite a lot of attention and criticism. So yes, it is a military, pseudo-military, officially it's a democracy, of course, because they had election, but we know it's a pseudo-military regime, but there is space for discussion up to a point. Yeah. So for the vaccine, of course, now has become a taboo topic, but it has been discussed.
Okay, thank you, Julia. It's interesting how you did point it out, the issue about the migrant workers, because the next question related to this issue, I think Ying Hoi can help to answer this question. It's for you. So in Malaysia, the civil society groups have made the hashtag Migran Juga Manusia, which translates to migrants are humans too, to highlight the plight of migrant workers. So how did the Malaysian government respond to these issues and many forms to vulnerability facing migrant workers? Perhaps Ying Hoi, you can unmute your micro and answer this question.
Yes, sure. I think if I'm not mistaken, just yesterday and today, our minister had just announced that the vaccinations is available for non-citizens, which also including the migrant workers, because in the very beginning stage of the COVID-19, Malaysian government has not been acting fairly, especially to the migrant workers. Even until today, vaccination, that is another issues. But now that the rise in COVID-19 cases in Malaysia, if you look at the statistics, mostly are actually coming from the factories, apart from the working places, where it reflects that despite of the standard operating procedures are being put in place, but it is not being kept in the or how to say in the situation that is supposed to be to contain the pandemic. And one major big groups that suffer from this is of course the migrant workers. And one of the ministers came out and say that they give the promise that when the migrant workers came for the out for the vaccination, they will not be arrested. But for me, I read that kind of statement differently. That means you have already instilled the fear among the migrant workers, and I don't think that is the way should go. And the Malaysian government definitely needs to change the whole perceptions and treatments on the migrant workers, because it is, for me, it is quite ironic that a government needs to came up with this kind of statement to say that you should not have fear when you want to receive the vaccination. So the whole system is totally wrong in that, and I hope the civil society, of course, on the same issues, have been pushing really hard for to recognize migrant workers and refugees equally with either you're non-citizens or citizens. So yeah, basically that's what I have to say.
Okay, thank you, Ying Hoi. And there's another question. I don't see Asian make a serious move to tackle this pandemic situation. Any suggestion from the speaker's view how Asian make a multilateral cooperation under this situation? So I think this question is for all of you. So perhaps all of you can answer to this. Thank you. Yes,
maybe
Ian.
I
Yes.
to say something very briefly.
Yes, please.
I mean, I would say in many respects, when does ASEAN really do much about anything, to be perfectly frank? And I think if you're looking at the pandemic as a public health crisis, I'd imagine that, and you know, the speakers today have reiterated this point, that many governments in the region have approached it not as a public health matter, but as a political problem. And if it's approached as a political problem, then the ASEAN Convention of not meddling in other people's approaches comes into effect. And we're seeing that, of course, now with the deafening silence around the military coup in Myanmar and other such things. I mean, I'm certainly familiar with the Indonesian case and to a lesser extent the Philippines. And you saw in both cases the administrations approaching it from early on as a securitized political problem. And that kind of approach really makes a regional coordinated response almost impossible from the start. So yeah, I think that's probably the main problem in that respect. That's, you know, it's almost a classic ASEAN problem of not meddling, but of course these are transnational problems that require a different way of thinking about things, but it's so deeply embedded in domestic political interests that it makes that almost impossible to do, including with the coordination of vaccines, where, you know, vaccine nationalism is becoming such a huge problem, and you'd hope in the region that there could be a pooling of resources, but I've seen no serious discussion of that whatsoever to date. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Next, perhaps Ibu Lia, you would like to answer?
Yes, I like to add to what I've been saying. Yes, indeed, this is the ASEAN way. I think this is, we agree, and we have seen a lot of statements since the very beginning of the pandemic. Actually, at the beginning, ASEAN was quite quick in linking up with the so-called +3 partners, as China, Korea, and Japan, to discuss the epidemiological side, the spreading of the infection, the COVID infection. This because we know that Southeast Asia was the first region to be infected outside of China, right? The first case in Chinese tourists in Thailand, and then the first death was again a Chinese in the Philippines. This was in January, and soon after we see ASEAN with this 3+ partner discussing about the epidemic, the spreading. Not many action were taken, but there were some initial talk about what to do, the lockdown or not the lockdown, and of course we know that most of the country at that time did not lock down, and they waited until after the World Health Organization, with the possible exception of Vietnam. Now, since then, there have been a number of statements. There have been discussion about distribution of medicine and of drugs, distribution of vaccine. There has been at this general level, but when it comes to really intervention, and they've been discussing even logistics, how to facilitate the logistic, but then in practice we have not seen. And the strange things is that they have created a new mechanism, while they had actually quite developed mechanism from the regional level to the national level for previous epidemic. SARS and avian flu, of course, caused quite a lot of investment in this region. Again, this is from my previous experience. There was a lot of investment into the pandemic preparedness, including within ASEAN as a regional structure, which could have been used, but instead new mechanisms were created, again, the ministerial level, at the health minister level, etc., etc. So I think beside the issue that Jan raised, the issue of consensus and issue of not interference, which become a barrier for taking this kind of regional decision. And this not only ASEAN, yeah? The European Union has also failed initially to coordinate the response to most of the countries have acted on their own for their own national interest without understanding that their interests are related to their neighbors' interest. I want to give the example of Thailand. When they closed the lockdown, all the Myanmar migrants had to come back to Myanmar, and they found the border closed. And again, there was no coordination whatsoever between Myanmar and Thailand without thinking about the consequences of this for Thailand as well as for Myanmar. So this narrow approach has been followed by most of the countries, including the European Union and ASEAN. So ASEAN is not the only guilty party in this regard. But after the shock, they have not been able to really come together. And I think there will be more pressure for ASEAN to try, especially, for instance, for economic issue like tourism. This is where there is a lot of interest. So ASEAN interests are not necessarily our interests, like human rights and this kind of thing, but they have economic interest. And there is where probably there will be more pressure to try to do something about facilitating tourism and opening up again of borders.
Okay, thank you, Julia. How about other speakers? Would you like to share your insights or opinions to this question? Gabriel, Sarah, or Yinghoi?
Me, that's okay.
It's okay.
Already very complete.
Okay. Yinghoi, you would like to add something?
Yeah, actually, my point is exactly what Ibu Lia mentioned in the final sentence about. I think ASEAN they came out with a lot of mechanisms. However, those mechanisms continue to be very much top-down approach. But I think when it comes to economic interests, I think they do are very concerned about the ASEAN economies, and I think those are the areas that they are focusing a little bit more rather than the other two pillars that are very often being neglected.
Yes, couldn't agree more with you, Yinghoi. How about you, Sarah? You want to add something? Because you told me that you don't have a good connection. Are you still there, Sarah? Okay.
Training in Bandung, she told me.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so there is someone who already raised hands. He would like to ask a question. So I call Ricky Kristiawan. Would you like to unmute your microphone, please? Hi, Ricky. Are you still there? Okay. While waiting, I think we can ask another question. How do Ormas react? Do they contribute to the struggle against COVID, and in what way? I suppose that there are different stances between Ormas conveying the government decisions and other more close to the people. Perhaps, Gabriel, you can ask the question by yourself if you want to add more.
Was the question for Ian? It concerns the Indonesian context more particularly, but I think that we can find this kind of auxiliary intermediate groups between civil society and the government or political leaders and parties in other countries in Southeast Asia. So maybe it can be of comparative interest also.
Sure. Thanks for the question. And I mean, there's two organisations that I have contact with. Well, one formerly no longer exists. That's the Front Pembela Islam, who were banned by the government just a couple of months ago. And the other is Pemuda Pancasila. And certainly Pemuda Pancasila is an interesting case because they've been very proactive in mobilising their networks to support the distribution of PPE, the distribution of social aid through their networks to poor communities in the context of COVID relief. But as is often the case with these particular kinds of groups, this has been very much intertwined with their own political interests. So as some might be familiar with, the Indonesian government, or specifically the police, wanted to mobilise existing local networks of authority, which include Ormas groups and often, paramilitary type organisations in a semi-formal role to enforce COVID protocols. And if you put this in a bigger context, I won't diverge for too long, but the bigger context is that we've seen with this administration, certainly in the last year, that they've had a quite radical push to what I would call paramilitarized society, with recommendations to reinstate Pam Swakarsa, which is a kind of civil security force, as a part of a broader policing regime. The linking of that to the policing of so-called radicalism, and also the reinstating of Bela Negara, which is a project, a longer-term project, which entails essentially ideological indoctrination combined with military training for civil society as an auxiliary force. It's been a pet project of the current defence minister, which is Prabowo Subianto. So groups like Pemuda Pancasila, it's sort of, in Indonesian, you'd say masa panen, like it's their time in the sun. Their deputy secretary, Sekjen, is one of the most senior politicians in government, in Golkar. And so this whole period for them has been fantastic. Now, the other example is of an Ormas that suffered a quite different fate, and it's been intertwined with COVID, and that's Front Pembela Islam. And of course, their leader, Habib Rizik, returned to Indonesia, gosh, when was it? It was late last year, to much controversy. And how do I explain this? I was involved in some discussions around this at the time, as probably the most diplomatic way I could put it. And there was a very strong sense from the government that COVID-19 was really a fantastic framework to do something that they wanted to do for some time, which was to detain senior leaders and to find a public interest argument to ban the organisation. So you saw the large gatherings of FPE. Some of you may have seen it when Habib Rizik arrived. I mean, it was a social distancing disaster in the context of Jakarta. You had tens of thousands of people crammed in. It was like a nightmare scenario. The government used that as the reason to arrest Rizik, to arrest senior people of FPE, who are still in custody to this day, and to build on that, the argument linked to maybe a more spurious argument linking it to terrorism, to ban the organisation. So in terms of Ormas more generally, COVID-19 has provided opportunities, seeing them as relatively self-interested. organizations, but also, as you mentioned, they bridge a weird kind of gap between state and society. So with Ormas, it's always a catch-22 where they're often predatory and politicized, yet at the same time, they can often deliver significant, genuine benefits to people because they're well-resourced. Pemuda Pancasila has forged a specific arrangement with the government for the distribution of sembako. This was rationalized by the argument that it would bypass established kind of, it was kind of a pre-Bumi argument. They'd argued that the prices were being inflated by particular conglomerates. And so Pemuda Pancasila has been distributing basic goods and making their own profit from it. But that's actually worked out well for some communities because they have much better distribution networks than some of the actors. So you've seen that mobilization. The other one is FBR, who I know well, and they've been very proactive. They haven't been denialists. They've recognized that COVID-19 is a genuine threat. They've done what they can to encourage people to socially distance and otherwise. And that's, I guess politically, I was quite surprised because often they're very reactionary. And of course, globally, there's been so many reactionary right-leaning groups that have denied COVID-19 and etc. But in Indonesia, generally, they've all been on the same page. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
No worries.
Okay, thank you, Ian. It's really interesting that the issue of Pasukan Bela Negara, I don't know how to say it in English. How do you translate it into English? Pasukan Bela Negara.
There's a literal translation and then there's a conceptual translation. It's like an auxiliary paramilitary force or something like that.
Paramilitary force, nation defenders, Sarah is saying?
Yeah, defend the state, auxiliary troops.
I'm curious, actually, it's a little bit out of the box, out of the topics. Does it happen as well in Thailand, in Malaysia, or in other Asian countries? This concept of Pasukan Bela Negara? Especially those who, how can I say, who is saying that they want to develop this kind of troops to protect the country, the nation from COVID, for example. I don't know, Ibu Lia or Ying Hoi perhaps can share your experience in your country.
I want to comment first on the Ormas, because Ormas, of course, we can also interpret in terms of religious mass organization of different kind, like Asia or Muhammadiyah or NU or all kind of other groups of all kind of faiths. Who have played quite a constructive role in bridging, again, especially at the beginning. And actually, Indonesia has provided very little formal social protection, relief, mostly to Tembaka, of course, through in food and in kind and money transfer only once for a couple of months. And of course, this is by far was late and now is short. So there is where all kind of civil society group as well as large mass organization, not necessarily of the one that Jan talked about, but they provide a very important supplement or even closing a gap in terms of what the government should do, but is not doing. We know also that there's been corruption case for the Minister of Social Protection because particularly for the in-kind packages that have been selected, and again, probably for political reason, because those raise funds, right, for a certain group during the local election. So again, we see how closely intertwined, but I also want to stress the more positive role of many of this other group, including civil society. group in the provision of relief and other form of support. Now, going to the paramilitary, I think Indonesia is, since Orde Baru and even probably before, has a long tradition of Pemuda Pancasila, has survived. I think was going a little bit down because the patrons of Pemuda Pancasila were supporting the Islamist group, because that was kind of, now they seem to have changed. But of course, I mean, how could Habib receive so many people in the airport if not allowed by the government to happen? I think this we need, so we know that that was also both the national government and the Jakarta government and the governor, they were more than pleased to meet with this person returning from the Middle East, right? I mean, he should have put in jail, maybe, because the partner was accused of pornography, but he was never touched for that. So of course he enjoyed protection. So if now maybe they want to sideline and go back to the original groups of Pemuda Pancasila, more nationalist book, we need to ask until when, right? Because this is what the game is going to be, and beside FPI is back in a new information. Now, does it happen in other countries? Yes, it does. I think Thailand has a are a little bit different, are a pro-government group that we have all kind of colors, like red, yellow, and they can be, of course, also used in particular context. It doesn't seem to be as widespread as in Indonesia, but again, maybe there is not as much need. The need for this group is particularly during, I think, like now in a context of democracy where you are trying to still keep to the old authoritarian rule. Myanmar, we know that there are many of this group that often have a religious Buddhist extremist form. We have seen them operate during the Rohingya conflict. Now again, they are letting out people from jail, from prison. We don't know if they are just small criminal or something more that then can create all kind of violence among civilians. Of course, this is the worry for Myanmar at the moment. So I think there are some serious concerns with all this kind of paramilitary group, and whether they can be considered civil society. I mean, it's very interesting discussion these days of whether some of this group like FPI are also civil society or not. And well, I don't know if we want to go there, but that is something that is important, I think, to reflect also.
How about Ying Hoi and Gabriel? You would like to add something?
No, just that I would like to go to the fieldwork to have more information about all that.
Yes, totally agree. Yeah. Okay, I think we can end. We may end our. Sorry. Yes.
Say something? Can you hear me?
Ah, yes, Sarah. Good to have you back. Okay.
It's not gonna last because it's raining like crazy outside.
Okay.
Sorry for being so silent from the beginning. What I just wanted to point out is that I think this bela negara process, or what it is called in other countries, is just the other side of the coin of the general militarization that is happening in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia. Because we see that militaries start getting more and more involved in operations that are not fight operations, war operations, more and more in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia in general, including handling with COVID and natural disaster and this kind of stuff. On the other hand, we have those civilians that are trained so that they can become cadangan in Indonesian. That would be like spare forces for the national armies. and maybe they would probably also give some help for this famous non-war operations. But what I think is interesting is that this blurring of the boundaries that is so I mean, this is the element that opens the door for anything in a way. Either it is something authoritarian, or it is something, a new definition of what people want, because maybe they're maybe part of it or maybe agent in it. I don't know. But this is something very specific. We've been talking about the blurring of the boundaries before, between business and politics, between religion and military and so on. But I think this civilian military aspect is very important, and it tends to be emphasized now that we have in a crisis context. So I don't know what's coming out of it, but I guess this is something striking for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think we may end our question and answer session. And please, Natalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, truly, for leading the question. This is a really interesting topic, but I'm sorry because we have a short time to discuss more. For all participants, please don't forget to fill the participant list in the chat box. For our conclusion, I would like to ask the short closing statement from each speaker. So please. From Ibu Rosalia, from Gabriel, Ian, or Ying Hoi, it's okay.
Well, I must say I am without words. I think we have talked a lot, but I think it's okay, in line with my presentation. I think for us as social scientists, we need to be more engaged with with the COVID epidemic, and with really expounding the boundaries, if we want to talk about boundaries, and take political position on many. And as I say, the vaccine is probably the first coming up. There have been many, there remain many. The issue of authoritarianism, securitization, there are many, but the vaccine is very concrete, and there are concrete measures that can be taken. We know what can be done, including this issue of waiving of the TRIPS agreement and the issue of IP. Now, these are things that we could do something very, very concrete. So while analyzing, also really look for strategic and concrete action, which make clear that COVID is more than a pandemic.
Thank you, Leah. Ying Hoi?
Yeah, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has generated this new social interactions patterns that are more sensitive to health issues, and at the same time with the development of the growing social solidarities to help each other and encourage the new socio-economic patterns. And I think such social solidarities is very fundamental and necessary in the effort to continue to uphold the law and human rights in the Southeast Asia. Although when we talk about community resilience, on the other side of the coin, it shows the weakness of the governments as well. So that shows the failure of the governments to actually uphold the duty to protect the rights of their own citizens. So I think those are the issues that I would like to highlight in this concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ying Hoi. Ian?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said in the presentation, this is a moment that's really exposing, giving great transparency to pre-existing inequalities and power relations. And so it's a time where a lot of things could happen. I think it's easy to feel despondent. I know I do quite regularly, but there's plenty going on where we can establish new kinds of solidarities and push for significant changes to address some of these issues. The flip side of that is if we don't try and organise more collectively on that front, as we've been just discussing now, increasing militarism, increasing illiberalism, the consolidation of inequalities in access to core social needs such as public health, those gaps could be widened. So it's really a critical juncture that we're at now, and so we should be trying to establish solidarities as best we can. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. Gabriel or Sarah? Do you want to? Yeah, Gabriel?
Please, Sarah, so I do like a short general conclusion.
Okay, sure.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I will sum up what has been said. Is it okay for the?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Let's click on it. Yeah, I guess I can only agree with what has been said earlier, and I think that indeed this crisis is just, for the moment, is just emphasizing and making more serious inequalities that were already existing, even creating more. And definitely what the government proposed as a response is not something that goes on the other way. On the other hand, I think what has been described by Gabriel, for example, is that there are local solidarities that start moving now. People start to organize. They cannot compete with the governments for the moment, that's obvious. But on the other hand, and if I put it together with the fact that I've heard many people saying that with the pandemics, they realized that their lifestyle was not exactly what they wanted, that they would like to change things, and so on and so on. People saying that they'd breathe it better when there were no cars because of the first lockdown and these kind of things. We can hope for something like a bigger consciousness coming out and people organizing and try to take things and make things the way they want them to be. But this can also be very much blocked very easily. I mean, when the pandemic stops, or if there is a very strong authoritarian action that takes place. So yeah, maybe we just keep it open for the moment. I hope for the best.
Thank you.
Okay, so I will try to, if you allow me, to do a short conclusion. So we agree that the different presentations show how entangled the several crises we currently face are. They expose the tight connections between the non-sustainability of our production and consumption modes, the damage that are done to our environment, the proliferation of sanitary disasters, and the development of austerity policies. Political verticality and the weakening of civil society actors makes it even more difficult for citizens to have direct control over the way governmental institutions choose to address this crisis. Thus, the epidemic is used by a small portion of the population, namely oligarchies, that I tried to describe a bit in my presentation. They use the epidemic as an opportunity to capture resources through a system of arrangements. The economic capital is based on the deregulation of certain public sectors, such as health and education. The capacity to accumulate economic resources is sustained by their political positions, and these positions are based on illiberal constituencies like some of the vigilante groups, as well as on the distortion of the constitution and its enforcement, for example, in order to reduce environmental rules and the supervision. Therefore, the current challenge for civil society in general and social movements in particular is to unveil the continuum between modes of extraction that kill biodiversity, modes of production that harm biosymbiosis between life species, and biopolitics that prevent people from taking control over their common destiny. What we have attempted here is to reveal the systemic dimension of these public issues and also to underline people's capacity to self-organize and take initiatives in order to solve collective problems. So we hope to continue this collaborative reflection together in our next events, and we will invite you to contribute and to attend. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel, for your statement. And so, thank you for all the honorable speakers, all the participants, Viscom Universitas Kristen Satya Wacana Indonesia, Junction, Thailand, especially Saint-Asti du Sud-Est Paris, France, and of course, Altersea. I hope we will meet in the next program. So stay healthy and stay happy for all. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you,
Thank you, Ibu
everyone.
Lia. Thank you, Yi
Thank you,
Hoi.
Ibu Lia,
Thank you,
Yang,
Ian.
Ying Hoi.
Thank you, truly.
Bye, Truly. Bye, Gabriel. Bye, Rob.
Bye, Ibu Lia. Thank you so much. See you in the next program.
Yeah. Bye, Natalia.
Thank you, Romulo Simanjuntak, for helping us in
Okay.
this webinar.
I'm so sorry about the technical issue. Gabriel, in the middle of his presentation. Thank you. We're gonna close this room in 5 or 7 minutes.
Bung Ulo, bisa tunggu sebentar kita evaluasi?
Oh, boleh. Oke.
Oke. Baik, terima kasih ya.
Ya.
Halo. Allô? Truly, tu m'entends?
Wih,
Wiwi.
Bung Ulo mungkin bisa
Ya,
ditutup YouTube-nya barangkali ya.
Ya, ini